I'll never forget that night. I was driving alone, as I often do. It was around 11 p.m., and I was on my way home after a long day at work. The road I take is usually deserted, the kind of road you'd expect to see only the occasional deer or the silhouette of a distant streetlight. It's one of those places that feels peaceful, almost calming. At least it usually does. But that night, there was something different, something heavy in the air. The fog had rolled in thick and fast. The kind of fog that coats the road in a wet blanket of gray, swallowing up the headlights and making the world outside seem distant and unreachable. My car's headlights barely cut through it, and the road ahead looked like an endless tunnel. I was driving quietly, the sound of the engine and the hum of the radio filling the silence. As I passed familiar landmarks, the old barn, the cracked road sign pointing toward the next town, I felt that odd, creeping feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle at first, like a change in the air, the way a storm feels before it hits. You know it's coming, but you can't see it yet. Then I saw it. In the rear-view mirror, the faint glow of headlights. It wasn't unusual to have another car on this road, but what struck me was how quickly the light was getting closer. It wasn't just another car following me. It was moving with a purpose, like it was matching my speed exactly. At first, I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was going to turn off at the next junction. But no, the light stayed fixed, like it was attached to my car, never gaining or losing ground. I glanced nervously at my speedometer. I wasn't driving fast, just the usual 50 miles per hour, but the light was still there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I accelerated slightly, thinking I could create some distance, but the light followed suit, speeding up right along with me. That's when my heart started racing. I didn't want to look in the rearview mirror anymore, but I couldn't help myself. Every time I glanced back, the headlights were closer, but there was no sign of a car. No movement, no shapes in the fog, just the light. It didn't make sense. There was no way it could be another car. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. But every time I looked back, the light was there a little closer. The road ahead seemed to narrow, winding through the trees as I approached a part of the highway that wasn't well lit. There's a small turnoff here, where the road splits into a tiny country lane leading to a nearby village. I decided to take it, thinking that if I could just get off this main road, I'd be safe. But as I turned, the headlights turned with me, as though they were following my every move. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I was now on a smaller road, surrounded by tall, thick trees, their branches hanging low, shrouding the path in darkness. I couldn't even see the road ahead. It was just a blur of fog and shadow. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. It was just a car, I thought. Maybe the driver was lost, or perhaps they were headed in the same direction. But the longer I drove, the more the anxiety gnawed at me. The light behind me never wavered. It was still there, staying just behind me, a ghostly presence that I couldn't escape. Eventually, I reached a point where the road turned again, leading to a small patch of woods that bordered a field. I knew this area well. It was isolated, nothing but empty fields and the occasional farmhouse in the distance. There were no houses for miles, just the eerie quiet of the countryside. And that's when I saw it. The car, or whatever it was, stopped. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like the air around me shifted. The light that had been following me, that had been so persistently close, suddenly stopped. And there, just a few hundred feet ahead of me, the headlights of the car were now shining straight at me from the edge of the road. It wasn't moving. It wasn't a car that had pulled off to the side. No, it was something else entirely. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. I thought about turning around, going back the way I came, but the road behind me felt just as empty, just as unsettling. I could feel my hands trembling on the wheel. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, I saw something I'll never forget. There, standing at the edge of the road, just past the beam of the car's headlights, was a figure, a person, or at least it looked like one. At first, I thought it was just someone stranded, maybe needing help. But then I noticed something. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, staring at me, frozen in place. There was something unsettling about the way it stood, like it was waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to get any closer. The figure's eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew me, that it was waiting for me, waiting for something. I had no idea what to do. My mind was racing, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. What was happening? Who was this person? Why were they just standing there, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour of the night? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things. But the more I stared at the figure, the more real it seemed. And that's when I realized the headlights of the car were still there, pointing directly at the figure, but they weren't illuminating anything around it. It was as though the light was focused solely on the person, yet the figure remained shrouded in a kind of strange, unnatural shadow. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring. It felt like hours. But eventually, I did the only thing I could think of. I sped off. I didn't look back. I just drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't care if I was speeding. I didn't care if I was going the wrong way. I just needed to get away. When I finally made it home, I locked all the doors, checked every window, and stayed up the rest of the night, waiting for that feeling of unease to pass. It didn't. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who the figure was or what the car was doing out there in the middle of nowhere, following me like it did. There's no explanation. There's no logical reason for any of it. But every time I think about it, I can still see the figure in my mind's eye. That empty, unblinking stare. And sometimes when I drive down that road again, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me waiting. That feeling of being followed never really goes away. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was just a strange encounter. But I'll tell you this, I've never taken that road at night again. And if you ever find yourself driving out there on that lonely stretch of road, don't be surprised if you feel like something or someone is watching you too.